Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Samuel Jr. Bermudez Double Fermentation Thermal Shock Processed Colombia from Manhattan Coffee Roasters. And there's the bag right there. And Manhattan, based out of Rotterdam, Netherlands. And this coffee right here is the highly anticipated final release from the infamous Diego Bermudez series of coffees that had previously featured Letty, Luna, and Salma, all of which we had also previously reviewed on this channel, so we are definitely going to review this one as well. One thing that caught my interest upon this coffee's release was the fact that this is the first time Diego Bermudez has opted for a variety other than the Geisha, as this one is the Churroso variety, which in itself has been a very interesting and unique variety this year. So that combination of factors will make for a very interesting and highly anticipated review. Really hoping to do this coffee some justice as well, as it's a very unique one. This right here is day 33. And recipe we went with for this coffee was our Manhattan recipe, which is a 16:1 water to coffee ratio brewed at 208 degrees Fahrenheit. I like this one best through the V60, which indicates a more medium fine grind. Roast profile for this coffee is definitely interesting. I think a lot of people know at this point that Manhattan tends to roast on the lighter side of roasters, even relative to a lot of European coffee roasters. This one possibly felt a little bit more developed to the processing method, as the processing method really makes this one a little bit difficult to distinguish. Hopefully that gives you a little bit of an idea on the roast profile of this coffee, as it's a kind of a tricky one. With all of that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 9, first impression. First note we have listed on here really does kind of summarize this coffee. It tastes like black licorice. So from the moment you open the bag, to the moment you grind the beans, to the time you're brewing the coffee, all the way to that first sip, it really radiates this very strong and distinct black licorice-like aspect. And the flavor note they have listed on here is star anise, and I've heard that star anise and black licorice taste really similar, and that's the flavor profile I was definitely able to pull from this coffee. But one thing I really wanted to highlight on this first day was just how clean it was. It was a very clean and defined flavor profile from that first try, and I would say that it's one of the most defined flavor profiles I've had to almost any coffee we've reviewed on this channel, so that left a very interesting and unique first impression. On day 12, another super black licorice forward cup of coffee, and what was a little difficult on this day was I was trying to find some other descriptors and ways to describe this coffee, as that flavor profile really dominated, and as a result it was hard to maybe pick up some other factors that were present within this coffee. Only thing I could really come up with was, after a slight cool down, there was an interesting herbal aspect to the coffee, but even then it was really just dominated by that strong black licorice aspect within the cup. Day 15, a weirdly better cup of coffee, as it was strangely sweet, and it was almost in a slightly toasted marshmallow-like aspect. Flavor descriptor I came up with for on this day was, think of a hybrid between a Lucky Charms marshmallow, just specifically the Lucky Charms marshmallows, and then black licorice, and it had kind of this interesting sugar sweetness to it, while at the same time being wildly herbal. So this was an interesting one. Day 18, back through the Chemex, and it has been pretty consistent across brew methods to this point. I think the reason I didn't like the Chemex as much was because it did kind of clear out a lot of the other aspects and really heightened the black licorice to the cup, as the only additional thing I was able to get was that slight herbal aspect to it. There is sweetness as it cools, but it's less pronounced, and this was the first time I'd said, okay, maybe the V60 is better for this coffee. Day 21, it's an oddly bright cup of coffee, as on this day there's a citric aspect right on the forefront, and that kind of describes my experience with this variety. Is oftentimes you get some interesting but oftentimes fleeting factors within it, as I kind of mentioned the citrus, which wasn't necessarily overly pronounced a lot of the time. Same thing with that interesting kind of toasted marshmallow aspect. I think it's just because this variety has a little bit of complexity to it, so this day was an interesting one. Continues to settle into that blatantly clear and distinct black licorice-like aspect yet again. It's very complex in terms of the herbality as well. It kind of reminds me of a shelf full of spices. Still very unique, still very different. Day 24, there continues to be consistency within the cup, as this time there's a super herbal and spice forward cup, but it's still quite clean, and the star anise black licorice aspect continues to dominate the cup, with a fair bit of chocolate a little bit more present in the finish. And this is actually an important day, because this is kind of where things start trending a little bit better in that direction. Day 27, a little more to add on this day, with the exception that it's been, well, pretty consistent. The black licorice-like aspect slightly toned down, and this is around this time I started to see a little bit of a toning down of that aspect, which, truth be told, I kind of needed, because that had been so dominant in the cup that I really needed to kind of pick out some other things. Additional citric brightness, rich chocolate aspect, a little bit more of that rich chocolate aspect in a sweeter manner, and still a little bit of that herbality. I think the verbena that they have listed on here, that's probably what I'm tasting, but I don't know what that tastes like, truth be told. It's just a herbality I've never really experienced before from any coffee, honestly. On day 30, cup is continuing to skew more in the direction of that sweet fudge, which is what I've been mentioning. It's kind of a little bit more in that chocolate-like aspect to it, as the strong black licorice aspect continues to skew a little bit more light, so it's not quite as dominant in this cup. And that's a positive thing, because at times I felt it could be a little overbearing to try to pick out some complexity and depth, because there's a lot of complexity and depth in it, but it's a little difficult to pick out when your mind is just focused on that strong black licorice. There's a almost creamy sweetness to the cup as well. It has an interesting sweetness. If you're able to get past that really strong black licorice aspect, then you find some unique sweetness. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And for a unique cup, you have a really unique tasting wheel. So, all right, let's start discussing this tasting wheel. We'll start with the two level 5s. The finish at a level 5. Yes, especially in the earlier days. This is one of those coffees where on a relative scale, you could say it's like a 6 in terms of the finish, because you really taste all of that black licorice, and you're tasting it for a very long time. But on this later day here on day 33, especially after the cup has cooled, it does have still that really strong finish, but maybe skewing a little bit more in the chocolate direction. Maybe that black licorice is a little bit more of an afterthought, which is actually kind of needed, because that really does tone down that one note characteristic that was present in the earlier days. Spice level 5, again, on a relative tasting wheel, this is like a 6 or a 7. I can't begin to express just how strong that aspect was, especially in the earlier days. And since I say black licorice, and since they say star anise, and star anise is a spice, I think we really have to put in that spice. But in addition to that, it just felt like a spice-like cup of coffee in general. So that right there, level 5, no question, the highest charting coffee for spice we've ever had. Even that kind of interesting Diego Bermudez coffee from Kelowna that was really heavy on the cinnamon. All right, a bunch of level 4s. So we'll start with the bitterness at a level 4. Yeah, black licorice to me tastes bitter. That's the part that's really high. And given just how strong it is, that's going to be pretty high on this tasting wheel. Savoriness, level 4, that really interesting herbality that was very strong and distinct in this coffee as well, that I couldn't necessarily identify. Yes, that's high in the level 4. At the same time, the clarity in this coffee is really impressive. And that's one thing I've always had to say about these Diego Bermudez coffees is they are really clean cups of coffee. Letty, Luna, Salma, they were all really clean cups of coffee, especially for the processing method. So kudos to Manhattan on that one. It's always interesting that typically ends up at that level 4 mark. I don't think anyone's been lower. I don't think anyone's been higher, but it's definitely still a cleaner cup of coffee. Sweetness, level 4. I think this was done on an earlier day too, when it wasn't quite as sweet as it may be at this point, when the sweetness was maybe a little bit overshadowed by that really strong star anise black licorice aspect. So even then, I don't know if I could put it up to a level 5. The sweetness is more complex than like specifically strong or defined. Acidity, level 4. Yes, I don't think I have too much to add to that. It was just kind of what you would expect for the acidity. Florality, level 4. I think I'm kind of attributing that to the herbal florality. I don't know if verbena is a floral aspect, but given just how strong that herbal aspect was, I think the only other place I could put it in line with other than the savory aspect was that floral aspect. So best spot I could find for it on this tasting wheel. Chocolate, level 4. Yes, on these later days, I feel like most coffees, if they had this level of vibrancy to the chocolates, then it would probably be a level 5. But given that this is a relative tasting wheel and it's nowhere near as pronounced as the black licorice was the entire time of drinking it, it goes in that level 4 mark. Though at times I feel like a lot of other coffees would justify a level 5 for that. Body, level 2. Yeah, I think it's on the higher side of level 2. It didn't necessarily have the most body. I just kind of caught that while looking at this tasting wheel. I said, do I agree with that? I think it's right. Citrus, level 3. I've mentioned there were times there was this kind of interesting brightness to it. Felt like a little bit of citrus to it. So I feel like that is justified there. A bunch of level 2s as well. I don't think that any of them are really worth discussing because we really hit on the notable aspects of this coffee. And while complex, you can see it in this tasting wheel, it really did have very defined characteristics to it. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee, I don't know if I've had a weirder one, if we've reviewed a weirder one on this channel. This one right here, you gotta give credit for having such a, I can say that this one's transcendent because I don't think 5 years ago or even 2 years ago, I would have ever imagined that a coffee can taste like black licorice. And if it did, I would have imagined that there might have been some alteration to it. But given just how clean this coffee comes out and how defined this taste is, I'm honestly at a loss for words on how this coffee is. I'll be straightforward. I don't like it. I don't like black licorice. I don't like herbality. And I really enjoyed those previous Bermudez coffees that skewed heavily in the fruit direction, as that's typically the coffee I go for. But at the same time, I'm in admiration for the clarity of this coffee. And I enjoyed the unique sweetness. I just wish it wasn't overshadowed by that really defining characteristic to this coffee. The type of person I would suggest this coffee to. If you do like black licorice, this one's a very interesting one. That's obviously the first direction I'm going to point anybody towards for this coffee. But in addition to that, there's some fun sweetness. I found that interesting kind of toasted marshmallow-like aspect. I'm not a big fan of chocolate, but I found the chocolate within this coffee to be even a little bit more unique than a lot of other experiences. The herbality is also kind of wild. So these factors, I feel like the variety in itself, which has already been a unique variety, really heightened by Diego Bermudez's experimental processing methods, makes this one a really wild out there coffee. So if you're an adventurous coffee drinker, I can't imagine one that may be a little bit more adventurous than this one. For the most part, I think I'll leave this review at that though. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I would love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Samuel Jr. Bermudez double fermentation thermal shock processed Colombia from Manhattan Coffee Roasters. Thank you for watching.